I'm on the board of a company that provides cybersecurity software. And it's really interesting talking to some of these companies when we try to be providers of this software. One of the most frequent responses is, well, we have a corporate culture. All the people are used to using XYZ software, and now you want us to use something different. That's going to be, a big change. Well, it turns out I'm not going to sell the software now, but it turns out it's head and shoulders above what most people use. And if you lose your phone, it's wiped immediately. There's all kinds of innovative things that are in the software, but there's resistance for changing it, even though the CISOs, the CFOs, they say, yeah, this is probably a good idea. But then you bring in, the guys and gals who have to worry about the computers and the hardware. Oh, that's going to be a mess. Then, that's sort of, what separates, the girls from the women and the boys from the men in the boardroom and the C-suite to say, listen, we got to look at the present value cost of making this shift. And if it's wise to do it, we should do it. If it's not wise, then we shouldn't be doing it. We shouldn't have the conversation anyway. But again, I think it's those kinds of issues that are popping up all the time. And it's the decision-making metrics, the decision-making frameworks that I find both at the board and in the C-suite really are quite pedestrian. And also, frankly, again, in the United States, reek of short-termism. And again, these are regulatory constraints, so I get it. I get it why there's an incentive to think about short-term results. But I say, you can think about that as on the pathway to long-run profit maximization, long-run reputation building and maximization and brand building and so forth. But short-term regulation and policy should not be the end all. But I think, so the changes in policy are certainly matter. And then, if you double click on that or triple click on that, you get, well, what's going on in the world economy? And not just obviously in an economic perspective, but with respect to, a lot of disturbances, and I'm being polite when I say that, about what's going on in Ukraine, what's going on with our relationship with China and the like. And again, part of what I do for a living is educate boards and CEOs about how to think about those things from the standpoint of the business. I was looking at some data yesterday for a monthly Forbes column in the middle of writing about how boards judge geopolitical and geoeconomic issues. And to me, the data are striking about, to be quite frank, how nascent the view about how to deal with these things and questions were asked. Should the whole board, should you bring in someone, an outsider? Should you actually have God forbid, have a board of directors who actually understands this stuff, but also does business? And the data are all over the place. And so, it's that bigger picture of policy and regulation that for some people, for some boards, it's just too much to think about, or it's the white noise. But these all ultimately have microeconomic and business impacts. Too much of the conversation in boardrooms, particularly on sustainability, but other issues, is backward looking. And I would hope that the board conversations of the future themselves have a prospective lens. And what that means, and I was just on the phone last night, one of the boards I chair with the CEO, and we were talking, do we have too many committees? Do we have enough committees? And we were talking about the different charters of these committees. And I said, it's really important that we make sure the charters are, well written, that they sort of interlock with the next committee of the board and so forth, and that the sum of the whole is an integrated picture of what the board should be looking like. And the problem, as I look at boards, and unfortunately I look at a lot of them, there's not a lot of thought process about the charters and what kind of committees do we have? So every time, an issue rises up generally, but it could be ESG, it could be cyber, it could be financial. A lot of people turn to the audit committee. The audit committee, in and of itself, as long as it's really called the audit committee, doesn't have the capabilities or is staffed by the people who can think not just in terms of not just finance, but things about these other things, but also have a prospective lens. So when I think about what a future board would look like, I hope there is a creative use of committees and a creative use of the people who are around the table. And one thing I will accent, again, because most of my career has been working in emerging markets, I'm struck by the fact that when I look at the composition of European companies' boards or many other nationality boards outside of North America, most of the people around those boards have very little, if any, experience working in emerging markets, whether it's China, whether it's India, whether it's Malaysia, you pick your country. It's quite homogenous. And so, the question is, who do you have around the board that understands these markets, which are the future? Those are the high growth economies. And, rather than calling someone in like me to give a lecture to the board about, gee, what it's like to work in China, that's great, right? But that's no substitute for having people who have great business sense, understand all the stuff we've been talking about, but also have worked on the ground in these countries. It's an utter failing in my view, and I think it probably is most pronounced in the U.S. boardroom. My most recent Forbes column, it's a column which has provoked a lot of conversations, at least among my friends and readers. It's about the labor market for boards of directors, and it's an anti-competitive market. It's also the process by which board of directors are brought on is, actually is a form of really poor corporate governance processes. And so you're only going to get a good board if the process by which the board is built is sound and imaginative. And I put together data from the various groups who put out these surveys. I happen to be an expert in doing surveys, and I have lots of reservations about these particular surveys, but they're the data I got. It's striking that the rate of turnover of boards of directors, the rate of entry of new ones it's a very bizarre, I call it's an aberrant labor market is somewhat of the title. And I think I don't know how to break that problem, solve that problem. But it takes someone, I think, on boards to have the courage to say, what, I'm seeing all your faces all the time. You're great guys and gals, but you know what? We need to repopulate this board. We need to have more short-term limits. We need to bring in people of different cultures and X, Y, and Z. Now, when you talk to an incumbent on a board, they're not going to be very happy about it. It's one area that I'm actually quite pessimistic, at least on US public company boards, in terms of the kinds of independent directors that are there. And again, as an antitrust economist, I've been thinking about doing this column for a couple of years, and I finally did it. And I was actually very shocked at some of the numbers that I reproduced in the column. There are at least 2 or 3 levers here. One is to have a frank conversation with the board of directors, sort of off agenda about this. The second is, you can have outside, as we see in ESG and other things, you have outside stakeholders saying, you guys, and unfortunately, it's usually people who look like me, but I'm not on the boards I'm speaking about. It's time that we agree that you can maybe be appointed twice, but that's it. And that gives you an opportunity to go to another board. So it's a question of how you frame the issue. So that could be from external stakeholders. like investment groups or and proxies and so forth. But it's also going to be manifest, again, this is as an economist, by what's going on in the marketplace and how other companies are differentiating themselves by who is on their board. 10 years ago, before this ESG, took the world somewhat by storm, people did not spend a lot of time looking at boards, who's on board, what are they looking at, and so forth. I dare say that increasingly there's going to be a lens on who and how long people are on boards. So, and it's not just going to be internal decision, it's not just going to be investment advisors and shareholders, but it's going to be looking at cohorts and how are they growing. We've seen this a lot in the last 15 years, that people are buying certain products that are made by firms who have a certain brand name because of the way that they make the product or where it's made and so forth. Those are kinds of signals that boards have yet to even be exposed to. But the difficulty is you're talking about people's self-interest. Well, if you're really interested in company X, you're not just there to collect the board paycheck. You know what? And if you're really good, you'll maybe get on a different board. But time to step aside. And I think there's not enough of this frank conversation in boardrooms.